Back in the day, before I became a priest and before I became a lawyer, actually, I wanted to be a filmmaker. As a result of which, I read a lot of books on how to write screenplays. And one of the things I picked up early on was this idea that when you're writing a screenplay for, say, a movie or a play, it does you no good to say that a particular character, for example, is wise or clever or smart or courageous. Because, of course, that's the whole point of the story. That's the reason why you watch the movie. That's the reason why you watch the play. To see different characters put in various situations to reveal the inner truth of who they are, quite apart from what they profess themselves to actually be. Because, of course, oftentimes those two things don't actually coincide. And perhaps I must suggest that that's a really good way to understand this really famous story which you find in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, the story of the workers in the vineyard. So for those of you who aren't immediately familiar with the story, the gospel basically revolves around this landowner who represents God, who goes out into the surrounding town, which represents the world, in search of people to work in his vineyard. And he basically hires different people at different points of the day. So he basically hires people at dawn, 9, noon, 3, and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And he offers these different categories of persons different deals depending on what time they're being hired. So the people hired at dawn, he offers them the usual daily wage. So basically, work for me for the entire day, and I will give you the usual daily wage. The people he hires at 9, noon, and 3, he treats them as one category of person. So he says basically, look, work for me for the entire day, and I will pay you what is right, I will pay you what is just. And for the people who come at 5, he basically says to them, like, look, just come work for me, and we'll work out the details later. Now, on the face of it, this particular story seems to be all about economics and productivity and fairness, whereas the reality is that the whole thing is actually an elaborate ruse to reveal the inner truth of the characters involved. And the reason why you know that is for two reasons. First of all, if the thing was really about making money, the landowner would not have hired people at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and then paid them the usual daily wage. That's just bad business. But secondly, if he wanted to avoid people from being upset, all he had to do was pay the people he hired at dawn first, wait for them to leave, and then pay all the rest later on in the day. In which case, everyone would have been happy, and the ones hired at dawn would have been none the wiser. But instead, he very deliberately pays them in reverse order, beginning with the ones he hired at 5, and then ending with the ones that he hired at dawn. As a result of which, the ones hired at dawn complained to him bitterly, saying, look, you have made these other people equal to us, despite the fact we have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. So how does the landowner respond? Well, it's kind of interesting, but what he does first of all is that he picks out one guy from the workers he hired at dawn and calls that one person friends, otherwise translated as partner, comrade, or even playmates. And you see in this, he's basically trying to reframe the arguments. He's trying to say to these people, look, I am not your enemy. And so this is not simply some labor dispute between, power-hungry landowner on the one hand and disenfranchised workers on the other. This is a conversation between two friends, two partners, two comrades, two playmates. I'm trying to draw you into the great intimacy of my own inner life. Because if you think about it, what's the ultimate goal of the landowner? Again, not to make money, and certainly not to exploit the workers, but rather to draw these people into his own inner life, into the great energy, passion, and dynamism of God's very life. Mindful of what we hear in the words of St. Irenaeus of Lyon, the glory of God is a person fully alive. And we know that's the particular goal of the landowner because of this constant interplay between the word work on the one hand and the word idleness on the other. Because apparently, if you look at the original Greek, the word is rendered here as idle, which you find recurringly throughout the course of the gospel, is simply a truncated form of the word work. So basically, it could be rendered as one without work or one who basically does nothing. Right? And so the whole idea, even though it's quite subtle, is that if I refuse to allow myself to enter into God's being, his mission, his purpose, it's not simply a missed opportunity, but it's actually the refusal to receive the fullness of life to which God calls each one of us. That's what's at stake here. In any case, if we look at the entirety of the Lord's response, what he basically says is, friends, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? And in this, the Lord is being somewhat cheeky. So he's basically referring back to the original agreement with the people hired at dawn. And what he's saying to them is like, look, technically speaking, the deal was this. You work for me for the entire day, and I will pay you the usual daily wage. And so now at the end of the day, what am I doing? I'm paying you the usual daily wage. So if we're being technical here, the ones who are trying to go back on the agreement is not so much me, but it's actually you, by demanding more money at the end of the day. Anyways, perhaps the most provocative part of the gospel comes near the very end of the story, when the landowner says to the people hired at dawn, "Are you envious because I am generous?" Which clarifies the particular reason why these people are envious to begin with. Because if you break it down, the real reason why these people are envious is not simply because the others have been made equal to them without having put in the effort. No, the real reason why these people are envious, the real reason why they are jealous, is because they have been specifically provoked by the great generosity of the landowner. In other words, the people hired at dawn see the landowner being kind and merciful and gracious to these people who basically have nothing, in response to which they are basically enraged. Which speaks to the fact that the real issue here is not so much economic fairness. The real issue here is that the people hired at dawn are basically messed up. They're operating under this twisted logic which dictates that, look, in order for me to be a winner, there has to be a loser. In order for me to be rich, there has to be someone who is poor. In order for me to be happy, there has to be someone who is sad. And you see, here's the kicker. In order for me to fully enjoy the spoils of heaven, I need to know that there's basically some poor bugger burning to a crisp in the fires of hell. And again, what the Lord is saying to us in a certain sense is that is completely messed up. And more to the point, that is completely incompatible with life in the kingdom of heaven. And that's why the Lord finally says to them at the end of the gospel, "Take what belongs to you and go." He banishes them from the kingdom of heaven as embodied by the vineyard, despite the fact that the workers hired at dawn have worked all day long in the vineyard of the Lord. Okay, now obviously there's kind of a lot going on here, but it kind of begs the obvious question, what's the moral of the story? Well, at the risk of sounding simplistic or overly reductive, the moral of the story is essentially this. If you want to become the person that God is calling you to be, it's not really about being productive. It's not really about being efficient. It's not really about being busy. And so, for example, it's not about saying more prayers to my neighbor or doing more good works to my neighbor. You got to keep in mind that the people hired at dawn work all day long in the vineyard of the Lord, but they're ultimately banished by the end of the story. So it's not about that. Now, perhaps you might say that if you want to become the person that God is calling you to be, you need to recognize that all of us, without exception, are truly beggars before the Lord. We are nothing before the Lord, deserving of nothing, entitled to nothing, such that absolutely everything we receive in this life is very much a grace and a gift. And so, for example, God doesn't have to give you life, but He chooses to. God doesn't need to give you things in the context of this life, but He chooses to. God doesn't need to suffer and die such that you might live, but again, He chooses to because He is kind and merciful and gracious, and He loves you, right? Once you grasp that, it should fill you truly with eternal gratitude. And more to the point, it should change how you see your neighbor. It should help you realize that truly your neighbor is not your enemy. Your neighbor is not your competition. Your neighbor is not someone who must lose such that you might win. Instead, your neighbor is always the one that God calls you personally to love as you love your very self. And may God bless you all.